Welcome everybody. I am Nic Marks and this is Steve Bertshult. How do you say your second name? I keep hesitating, Steve.
Phonetically, Hearsome.
Hearsome, Steve Hearsome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Simon, it's great that you put in the chat, good morning, everyone. Why don't you say good morning to us and, or I don't suppose anyone's on different time zones actually this time of day. And perhaps where you're from. And we're going to talk today about how culture fix isn't a silver bullet, and there are some things you can do about it. So I don't know, Steve, you want to introduce yourself first quickly, and then I'll also talk. What I think would be great is if you can use the chat for comments, for chat, saying who you are. If you have questions, then please put them in the Q&A function. There's a colleague of mine on the line who, Emma and Megan, actually two of them, who will check the Q&A for questions. The format we're going to do is we're going to introduce ourselves, and then Steve's going to lay out a case, I'm going to respond, and then just put any questions in there, and we'll start flowing to an informal chat after that. So nice to see people checking in with the chat. I'm afraid if I reach towards my screen and touch it, it's because my laptop has failed this morning, and I'm on an iPad, which is actually really delightful, but I haven't quite worked out how to leave the Zoom function on, so it keeps on fading away from me. So I apologize if I keep on leaning towards the thing, but it's just to see how many people are in and whether there's anything in the chat. Steve, please do introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nick. So the main technology failure on my end is me this morning, so you'll probably hear I've got a stinking cold. So today's session is brought to you by lemon and ginger and paracetamol. So if you can't hear me, please say, and I will endeavour to make myself clearer. And also, if I make no sense, as is sometimes the case when you've got a head cold, please tell me, because it will make total sense in my head, but it may be utter gibberish to you. So please do tell me. So I'll keep it short and sweet. I'm an organisational consultant and supervisor and coach. I spend most of my time working with two kind of groups of people within organisations. Firstly, senior leaders, those who are wrestling with complex problems, which could range from strategy through to collaboration, through to innovation, but more typically, bluntly, their relationships with each other and their relationships with themselves. And the other group of people I spend lots of time with are those people who are being tasked by senior leaders to change and transform organisations. And those typically are internal change agents, org development people, org design, HR, those kinds of roles. Often those are the people who find themselves the nodes through which the crazy flows. And they are often the people who are on the end of lots of the hopes and fears and anxieties about, please give us an answer, give us a fix to this complex problem. So those are the two groups I spend most of my time with. And the last thing to say is the stuff I'm talking about today is the fruits of a couple of years of research and writing on the stuff that me and talking about today. Me and Nick are going to be discussing. And I'll pause there.
And of course, Steve, you and me have a connection, which we found out, don't you? Is that you want to talk about Surrey?
Yes. So I did my master's at Surrey in something called Change Agent Skills and Strategies, which sounds very highfalutin, but is exactly that. It's how on earth do you become an agent or facilitator of change at one-to-one group and organisation-wide levels? And it was known. Somebody told me once it was known as the Masters in Crying, which is I did plenty of, and then I found out later on that Nick did an earlier cohort than me, so he carries the same kind of barcode at the back of his neck that they tattoo you with when you finish.
Yeah, it's a very brilliant 3-year part-time masters, wasn't it? And very forward-thinking in lots of ways. In that you had learning sets, which I'm sure that perhaps we might even talk about today, the way that we can learn from our peers. We even had to mark each other's papers. So whenever we did a paper, you had to mark your own paper and give yourself a score. You had to mark a colleague's, and then there was a tutor's score as well.
Absolutely.
The university weren't quite brave enough to let anyone but the tutor's score actually count. But giving a low grade to one of your colleagues was very challenging, but sometimes you had to. And if the scores were very different, we had to talk about it. It was a very interesting course. So I am Nic Marks. I am a statistician by trade. That is my sort of core skill. I also trained as a therapist before I did the CAS course, and then I did the CAS course later. So I had this sort of mix between hard statistical skills and sort of more softer people skills. I used to work in the think tank world. I used to advise the Blair and then the Cameron government about how to measure well-being. And then after I did a TED talk in 2010, I then set up a business to measure and improve employee experience for ID Pulse, who are hosting this webinar. And Steve is a sort of partner of ours. We're sort of, he is kind enough to recommend some clients to use Friday Pulse, and we're working with him about how a measurement tool can support his work in certain circumstances. So we decided we do a webinar together, and I think that's a lot of fun. And we're going to set it up not into adversarial, but to, as a colleague of mine said, Steve is in the red corner, I'm in the blue corner, although I don't know, you're in the floor shirt, I'm in the round shirt today. And Steve's going to do an opening position, because in a way, his challenge to me is about, what do people want when they're talking about improving their culture, and how it's driven often by unconscious behavior, I guess. But please, Steve, lay out your case.
So I'm going to contextualize this very much in the space of how it is that organizations and leaders look for quick fixes and guaranteed solutions to complex problems and challenges. And culture, by definition, is a messy, complex challenge. If any of you who are listening have ever been in an organization which has tried to mandate culture change, you may well have experienced the difficulties with that. And I have worked with clients who've tried to mandate culture change, and funnily enough, it doesn't seem to work. So I'm going to start with laying out some of the issues with why it is that we look for silver bullets and quick fixes to complex problems. I mean, the first thing to say is, if there was a quick fix, we'd all be buying the same book. We'd all be going to the same guru. And last time I checked, there isn't one book or one guru that we all go to solve our problems when it comes to organizations. So clearly there isn't a silver bullet. And yet, some of the behaviors that I see in organizations, and I see in individuals who wrestle with culture and things like that, is we're desperate for some guaranteed solution. So why is that? Well, one thing is the fiction of fixability. This idea that everything is fixable, that if you spend enough money, or if you find the right guru, or if you read the right book, somebody will have the answer to the problem you've got. The second factor here is there's something to do with pace combined with laziness. So I hear lots of stuff about how fast life is now in organisations, how it's a VUCA world. Well, last time I checked, it was pretty VUCA post-World War II. When I think about my parents and grandparents and the lives they had, if you talk to people who live in some of the conflict zones of the world, and you talk to them about VUCA, they quite literally will laugh at you at the idea that somehow rather this is novel. So the pace thing overrides our need for some considered reflection on what might actually help with things like culture. And there's also a laziness that goes with that, because it's a lot easier to say, oh, let me call up somebody, maybe a consultant from the Big Four, or a small boutique consultancy, or a solution provider like Nick, or a consultant like me, and say, come on, Nick, Steve, fix it for me. I don't want to bother with having to think this through myself. And another view would be that there's also a kind of a legacy of an enlightenment promise. You think about the Enlightenment, that the world was a fully predictable and certain place. And the problem is it's not. And again, if you look at the way in which some solutions are sold to organisations, things like, for example, ProSci, and there's plenty of other methodologies, they present as in a way which says there is an answer to this stuff. Another factor is privilege. The idea that we somehow rather deserve a solution to our cultural challenges. We work in the global north. We're very wealthy. We have all these wonderful offices. When we're working hybrid, we have hybrid technology. It's a very privileged world we live in. So of course we deserve a solution to our complex problems. And then we come to arguably the biggest set of factors, which I was doing some work with a friend and colleague, Simon Kavickia, and we ran a webinar last week on something we coined the unholy trinity. And the unholy trinity consists of ego, shame, and narcissism. And here we get to the real nub of what's really going on. So all those of you who are currently listening, I'm going to invite you just to do a little thought experiment with me. And I've got 3 questions for you. My first question is this, and I'd like you to genuinely reflect. If you want to, make a note of this. How do you want to show up in your work? How do you want to show up in your organisations? Okay. My next question is, how do you actually show up? How do you actually show up? And what data have you got that tells you that you do in fact show up like that would be another one. And here comes the kicker. How do you fear that you might show up? How do you fear you show up? Now, if there's a massive gap between the first and the third, that's where the problem comes in. So let's just unpack a wee bit what we mean by ego, shame, and narcissism. I see Francis is there, and you were there, Francis. So if I misquote either me and Simon from last week, please dive in on the chat and correct me, because as I said, I've got a stinking cold, so it could come out totally different. So firstly, ego. That's how we take ourselves to be. Okay, it's our self-image, our projection of into the world of who we aspire to be. It's an ideal. And if you think about leadership, how often do we see leaders, particularly in the political or the media sphere, who project out into the world some idealized notion of how they want to be? Then we get the shame, that feeling of failing to live up to our ego ideal. We've set up our stall to be this superhuman, this person who has all the answers, and we fear rejection and inclusion if we actually don't live up to that. And lastly, narcissism. So that's the process of identifying with these self-images and ego ideals and manipulating the environment around us and those people around us to maintain our self-images and ego. And in the context of what me and Nic are talking about, think about how that might manifest in the decisions and the behaviours of leaders who are trying to find solutions to complex problems. It is not very congruent with my ego ideal as a all-seeing, all-doing, all-conquering CEO if I can't come up with a solution or find a superhuman consultant who can come along and give me the fix, because I've set my stall out that I know all this stuff. Okay. So how might this trinity manifest? It comes through the anxiety about being good enough. It comes through self-doubt, a tendency to judge oneself and others, because clearly none of us have ever experienced leaders judging people around them, or our colleagues judging people around them, or ourselves judging ourselves and others. It never happens at all. Grandiosity in defence of the above. And again, clearly there's no leaders that we experience as being grandiose. I recognise in myself my own grandiosity, so I have that in me. A preoccupation with appearing good in others' eyes. I have to appear this perfect version of myself. So those are some of the ways in which they might manifest. And if I think about my work, and I think about the work, when I was talking to Simon in the last couple of weeks as we prepared for last week, how does this then manifest in the interactions and the relationships between people as they try and make sense of things like culture and trying to resolve some of the tensions? Well, it comes up in a preoccupation with status, of this, what I mentioned, of the living up to self-images and ideals, of wrestling with the reality of not knowing. How okay is it for you to not know how to resolve your tensions and difficulties with culture? There's a denial of our humanity and indeed our fragility. And that's where you get this whole lonely man or lonely hero ideal that we still have. I'd argue that we're still overly wedded to heroic leadership. It comes up all the time still. You'd hope that by 2022 we'd be a little bit over that. And without making too big a point about it, it's really interesting to be doing this in the week of the death of our monarch. And there is a wee smidgen of heroic leadership stuff going on at the moment. The idealizing that our monarch was this saintly figure and everything she represented talks to our hope that there will be somebody who can rescue us. There's a terror of dependency, the fear that we are actually going to be dependent on somebody else who might actually mean that we can't do it on our own. And then from a consultant point of view, and this is where me and Nic then also are on at the end of this, is there's the intoxication of having the expert in the room. If Nic walks in with Friday Pulse, the intoxication as he talks of his wonderful CV and his background, his research base and his case stories, I can project onto Nic that if I have Friday Pulse in my organisation, it'll all be fine. Because clearly that's what happens when we buy in solutions. It always works. And as a consultant, there's also the collusion that goes on. There's a functional collusion, which is just that I know that clients want to project onto me a certain expertise. It shows up when somebody says to me, "Oh, Steve, you're a subject matter expert in OD." To which my response is, "Really? Well, I have all the answers?" No, really sorry, I don't. I've got some questions. I know some stuff. But there is also an intoxicating hook in that. Oh, how lovely it is to have somebody stroke me and tell me how brilliant I am. But normally, that's when I know that there's a problem. And just to spin through, thanks a lot, Nic. Just to spin through the last ones, we then get to this place where we then rely on control rather than being comfortable with uncertainty and the potential that might present in terms of resolving some of the tensions we have. The avoidance of anything that might actually rupture relationships, which is why the vast majority of organisations I work with say they collaborate well, but when you ask them whether they prize harmony over anything all else, they invariably say yes, because they can't do constructive conflict. And we also have the deeper shadows that actually lurk in this when we talk about culture. If you talk about culture, you have to talk about things like gender, race, sexuality, etc. They are lurking there. And the last point I'll make is that in order to resolve some of these issues, we need to have a deep reflective practice. The problem is organisations rarely talk about reflective practice, and when they do it, they tend not to actually be up for what it really entails, namely thirtling in our shadows. And even in the consulting profession, people like me, and I know this having not done it deeply enough earlier in my career, I challenge the idea that many consultants have a reflective practice. And my evidence for that is that there are only 3 places you can go to do a program in qualifying to be a consulting supervisor, and nowhere you can go to become certified as a consulting supervisor. Coaching supervisor, yes. Consulting supervisor, no. So what I'm painting here is a picture that is one of inherent mess, uncertainty, unknowns, human fragility, and an unwillingness to actually accept that the best we can offer any of us as we try and resolve these issues is a space for inquiry set against many different players and factors that are colluding with the idea that if we hang around long enough and search long enough, we'll find somebody who will fix whatever complex problem we have. And in this case, we'll bring it back to culture. The idea that there is a quick fix, a silver bullet for culture, is an absurdity. And that's me.
Thank you, Steve. A challenge and actually excellent. The need for reflective practice. So as I said at the beginning, I had an early training in therapy, psychotherapy, and I didn't practice very long as a psychotherapist, but supervision was massively important to that process. And I often actually think that the therapeutic process has affected my whole way of doing statistics, in that I used to go and see this wonderful older wise woman who was actually called Nan. Her name was Naomi, but everyone called her Nan. So there was this probably projection immediately on the sort of figure. But she used to say to me, Nic, really a therapist only does 3 things. They listen to their client, they reflect back what they've heard, and then they ask some challenging questions to help them do things. And I think of my statistics as doing that, which is that the statistics are, the word comes from state and the idea that you're looking at populations. So you're asking populations, you're listening to the population. When you do collect your statistics, you're gathering that data, you're reflecting it back in reports, and then as you write a report, you ask challenging questions. And that process is a cyclical process, a learning process, which I think we did a lot of stuff on our course about action learning and other ways, and Gestalt cycles and all sorts of things. And I think that Steve and I probably share, I think, when we think of the world very cyclically rather than linearly. We don't think about this process that you have a linear process where you do something, you plan, and suddenly there's a result. We think about it as a learning process. And I think that culture is a complex problem. In fact, I'm a fan of I guess you could call him an evolutionary psychologist, Robin Dunbar. As a statistician, I'm a bit of a fanboy because there's something called the Dunbar number. He's got a number named after him. How cool is that? The statistician, there's a number, it's 150. And his number 150 is very interesting in that it's basically supposed to be the size of a human social group. And he gets that data from looking at the size of our neocortex compared to the rest of our brain. And in primates, we have a very large prefrontal and neocortex. Why do we have it? You know, it's actually, any of you women who've given birth have experienced the pain of having a large prefrontal neocortex, because our head size is far too big for our hip size. If your hip size, then it becomes a very difficult birth because of that. And the investment in evolution in this is it's because it's very, very functional. And what does this large neocortex do? It helps us navigate the complexity of relationships. Human relationships are the most complex thing in the universe. They're far more complex than quantum science and, and relativity. That's much easier to understand in human beings. I would hazard a guess that everybody here's most painful experience in life has been relational. Possibly a personal health issue, but then actually normally start worrying about who you're leaving behind or what if you've got a real one. But it's like, actually it's about relationships. And why do we gather together and work together? Because we solve problems better together than alone. Many people working on a problem create different ways of looking at it, and there is a whole synergy that emerges out of that. But it's difficult. Even our one-to-one relationships, but there's only two of us in a relationship, are complex. And actually, to be honest, we don't know ourselves as well. We surprise ourselves often. We are complex beings. So a culture in an organization is very, very complex. And leading a team is a very difficult thing to do. It's, people sort of think it's easy. It's not. There's lots and lots of relationships in there. Actually, the business side of leading a team is much more straightforward. Here's our targets, here we're doing, this is more of a mechanical process. Managing the team is much more complex. And at the end of the day, I would say that organizations don't have one culture, they have many micro-cultures. Teams have different cultures depending on the team leader, the team dynamic and everything. So there's a lot of complexity in there. And how do we approach complexity? So Steve says there's no silver bullets, and I wish I'd thought of this when we were writing the title, but I do think there's some golden rules that we can come up with. I think there are rules that we can start to define about that are going to help us stand with that complexity and deal with it. And there are lots of clues. There could be lots of ways of writing these rules. We can take lots of things. If any of you have ever been in education, there's an educational psychologist called John Hattie, who wrote a very good book called Visible Learning. And he talks about how he's talking about the education system as in school system, but he's saying that students do best when there's three things, which is when there's clear goals, when there is a deliberate repeated practice, and when there is good feedback. And so the clear goals in terms of culture are hard to define. I have my own way of doing that. And what I would say is that the sign of a good culture is when people are happy and productive, that actually they're productive because clearly it's business we're talking about here. There's no point people just sitting around and being happy. They're happy because basically they're enjoying their work, they know where they're going, they feel they're contributing, all sorts of things. So if you've got an unhappy, productive team, you're going to have a burnt out team. If you've got a happy, unproductive team, they're slacking. They're not really doing enough. If you've obviously got an unhappy, unproductive team, that's miserable. But what you really want to do is create a happy, productive team. And to me, that's the sign that there's a good culture. I think there's room for lots of different, if you like, personalities and cultures. You can go from a Ray Dalio, hedge fund where it's hyper rational and people challenge each other everywhere. For most of us, that would be too uncomfortable to be able to living in that environment. Very productive, but if you're, perhaps on a slight neurospectrum towards some way, that might work. To ones which are much more inclusive and just different personalities, I think that's fine. You're gonna that's all fine, but the need is still the same to create happy and productive teams. The deliberate practice, this is really what Steve, I think, is talking to, is that actually we need a reflective practice. We need something that helps that. Team leaders are so under-supported in people skills. Management training has, even whether the world's just staying at the same level of complexity, the amount invested in management training is going down at the moment. Only about 30% of managers receive any training on, no, in fact, it's 20%, receive any training on people skills. They just assume to have them. And actually the specific things we need to understand about working with teams and how we do it and have the confidence to. So I think there's an awful lot of avoidance of dealing with people stuff because people don't feel, what do you talk about? Not shame, but you talked about something else. There's an avoidance that goes on there. So I think that, and then there's the feedback. If you've got a complex system, then probably the most important thing is to create feedback from that system so you know how it is evolving, how you navigate it. And this is where I think the statistics comes in that I think statistics can act as a feedback loop, that basically by gathering data regularly, you start to know what direction you're going into. This is my hope for Friday Pulse. This is my case for Friday Pulse. Not being a silver bullet, but being something that can help guide you. It's something that will help you find your own solution. So my opinion on this is that, and I'm a statistician, I think a lot about how you measure things. We offer a measurement tool on how happy teams are, not how productive they are. We offer it on how happy they are. And it's, at the end of the day, it's very, very simple. We ask people every week, how was your week? How happy were you? And that data gets fed straight back so that you know if something's going wrong quickly in your culture, whether that's at an organizational level or at team level. And so I've done all sorts of very long questionnaires on people's happiness at work. My first questionnaire was 108 questions. Can you imagine how boring that was to fill it in? But I sort of thought in my naivety, I needed to understand the whole complexity of it. And what I began to learn was that even if I asked a lot of questions, I still had more questions, like why do you not feel this? Because they've ticked a box and it's 1 to 5 on something like, I can't think of a question right off the top of my head. I should be able to, it's things like, how well do you get along with your colleagues? And if they haven't, well, why don't you? So immediately you're into a why after it. So the best thing you can do, I think, is gather what I call the good, bad signal. Is it going well for you or not? When I used to look at my data sets in great depth, you'd find this what's called a factor structure of data, which is basically how does the data hang together? And always at the center of every bit of data I looked at was 40–50% of the variance was explained by one factor, which is their work going well, is it not? I've done this even in theatres, by the way, where you ask people, they come out of theatre, have you enjoyed the play or not? There's lots of reasons people could enjoy a play. It could be that the topic was brilliant. It could be they love the singing and the dancing, or the hugely challenging thing. It could have been they just having a nice night out with their friends. Lots of reasons. But the first thing is that they enjoy themselves. And that is the most important factor. And you can gather that in one question. So I've become very interested in that because it's a very cheap as in financially cheap, but also cheap on burden on the respondent, because you don't want to overload people. As Steve said, people are busy, they're maybe lazy, yes, probably. There's a lot of things going on, but they don't want a big long answer. So ask very simple data and feed that back. So that's the feedback. Now, what you end up doing, I think, is recommending that the golden rules are that you gather feedback very regularly, but then you meet and reflect on it. And so the golden rules really become about the discipline, the deliberative practice of actually talking at a team level, because we experience work in our human scale teams of between 3 and 10 people, talking together about how it's going. Take 10–15 minutes, maybe half an hour a week, and discuss how was last week. You don't need any statistical tools to do that. You can set that culture up in your team tomorrow. How was last week? What went well for you? What didn't? In engineering terms, that's friction and flow. Get rid of the friction, increase the flow. It's a heuristic, if you like, if you start wanting to go, an algorithm or a solution is looking for a definite thing and plotting a way to it. A heuristic is, how do we approach this? How do we do this? And that's in the spirit of Nan used to recommend to me with therapy, is that you have the repeated practice of therapy where you meet once a week, you talk for an hour, the therapy hour, and you discuss how things are going in towards a solution. In a much simpler way, with teams, I think it's just about meeting about last week. The last thing I want to say, and I'm probably giving myself a 2-minute warning here, is that there's lots of data for this, by the way. I just written a blog article put out later today on just looking at a very simple thing, which has got no teamwork in it at all, but it's the relationship between a call operator, someone that takes a call in BT, and the customer. And who sells more to the customer? Okay. And they found out that operators that were generally happy that week sold more, sold 13% more. That's all great. Why? Why did they? Well, they looked at the types of calls they took. If there was just a simple ordering call or someone ringing up to an order, it made no difference whether the call operator was happy or not. The more complex the call got, the bigger difference it had. If you were dealing with an unhappy customer complaining about their contract or something, the people who were confident and happy, I guess, were able to sell them more a solution than the ones who weren't. Because when we feel good, we have more capacity to see the bigger picture. We're able to respond more flexibly to it. And it's a complex space. But one of the things I really think that happens with happiness positivity is that we are able to cope with complexity more. We're able to deal with uncertainty more, in Steve's terms. And so my starting place becomes, I'm a statistician, collect data on how happy teams are, feed it back, and encourage a deliberative practice so they can approach this complex area of how do you create great team cultures. So that's my 10 minutes and Steve's. Emma or Megan, are there any questions or comments in there? Because I'm sure Steve and I can ask us some questions, but I'd really like you to ask your questions. You know, we're here to serve you, really. Steve and I can have a nice chat on our own if we want to. So have people got questions in there or comments?
Yeah, we've got one question, which is, can culture be measured accurately, either as a snapshot in survey and polls or long term?
So I guess that is a question for me. And I would say I always talk about this as in, when we say measure, do we mean capture perfectly? No. There's an old Chinese phrase, which is that the finger that points to the moon is not the moon. And the moon is the culture. The indicators are the fingers pointing towards them. Can we create interesting data? Absolutely. So as I said, we measure weekly team happiness. It's very dynamic, and actually you see the ups and downs because experience is very dynamic in culture. And then we do deeper dives into what we see as the key drivers towards happy teams, which is called the 5 ways to happiness at work: connect, be fair, empower, challenge, inspire. But they're basically principles and drivers of what good experience is. So I think measurement should be light, in my opinion, because it should be opening the door to conversations rather than it should be asking questions of you. So in that whole sense that Steve was saying about there perhaps being, answers aren't simple. Questions, I think, are great because they open space. So that would be my simple answer to that.
And then Francis has said, I suspect culture is a dynamic of social process. So just what your opinions on that is.
I think, Nick, given the fact we both did the programme at Surrey, we both we would violently agree on this. Yeah, absolutely, it is. Although what's interesting is not whether or not we all agree or a subset of us agree that it's a dynamic social process. I was talking to a client that I'm starting work with in the health sector this week, and I'm about to start 6 months of supervising a small team that are working on a behavioural framework and culture. And I said, has your organisation defined what it means by culture? To which the response, I think, if I remember correctly, was, I think we've seen something, we'll have to go and have a look. But that, of course, is a key point. What are the assumptions about the nature of culture in a given organisation? Which goes to a wider question about the assumptions we have about organisations and organising. So when I was listening to you talk, Nick, about happiness and the importance of gathering feedback and meeting and reflecting, absolutely. Where I went to was, and in how many organisations, particularly when anxiety is rife, do we revert to command and control, and we remove the spaces for inquiry and for actually chewing on the feedback? And the kind of stories I hear, I vividly remember in one very prestigious, very old organisation a few years ago, hearing a client say that at a town hall with the CEO, where they've been invited to ask any question, he piped up and asked a question, only to be cornered later on by one of the senior leaders and to be told, you can't ask questions like that. So there's this tension around the rhetoric of what organisations say they want when it comes to culture, and the reality if they do start to open up the kinds of conversations that you're alluding to, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, really, this is about what Google and Amy Emerson call psychological safety. Are you allowed to stand up and challenge things? Is it safe to fail? Is it, you know, all those sort of things? I mean, those are the sort of bedrocks of good culture. You know, I've got a colleague and he challenges me all the time. And, you know, I'm the CEO and I sometimes find that uncomfortable, but it's always a good learning process. You know, and that I think to not be open to that feedback would be disastrous. Yeah.
Well, it is. I have another client who I'm coaching at the moment, who what's becoming clear is that the organization wants her to be less direct and challenging. And I started off thinking this is a stylistic thing, and, you know, a kind of a presence and impact thing. And there is a flavour of that. But what's become clear is that she's one of those people who asks lots of questions and points out when things are asserted that jar with reality of her experience in the organisation she works with. So guess what? You know, the feedback loop is effectively stalled. There is no feedback loop. It's a one-way.
Yeah.
It's an ersatz feedback loop.
What feedback loop?
Ersatz, German word, kind of fake, synthetic, you know.
Pseudo.
Pseudo, that's the
Okay.
word. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think there's quite a lot of those sort of things. I think it's quite feasible that people use Friday Pulse as pseudo feedback loop, as in they want to sort of just check. I think we have a variety of clients about how well they use it, from brilliantly to okay. And maybe the okay ones are looking for the silver bullet solution. I don't know. I think it's something when you're starting. Yeah, I think it's something to think about how we can support them to get more value out of it.
Yeah.
It's an interesting. So there's a question in there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Simon.
So, a question from Simon that says, can you subdive culture into various subgroups such as safety culture, and if so, who is responsible for the changes required?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, Simon. I mean, I think that our different. I see different what I call fingerprints of culture. So different things, you know. So we certainly talk. So I guess a safety culture might be what you're just talking about, Steve. Is you know, when people value harmony over, what was it? Harmony over constructive.
Harmony over working through differences, basically.
Yeah. And I think actually when we get into the well-being, happiness space, and I think we've really seen this over the last couple of years, where genuinely I think organizations want to be empathetic. They want to listen to what was going on for people. They you know, and then there's a thing of, what do I do with that information? Do I have to agree with everything that people want, you know, for their well-being? Or, you know, how can we negotiate that? So actually there's a fear of actually asking too much people, because then there has to be a negotiation about what actually happens. I mean, so much easier to tell people what to do than to ask them and then negotiate. You know? So it's
which I think links to what Francis has put in the chat, which is organisations focus strongly on success, which can seem to equate to or supersede happiness. So, you know, happiness is important up to what point? You know, at what point does happiness become a nice to have rather than a we must have?
We might have different opinions on that, and I think also what is happiness, in the sense that I mean, actually, when the person said culture is a dynamic process, and I think of happiness as a dynamic process. I think there's a sort of image of happiness that's going and lying on a beach, and it's sort of like a state you get to. I think of it as a very ebbing and flowing, always up and down. And actually, the way to build a happier team, and I think there is an optimal level of happiness. In fact, we have a scale of 1 to 5, right? And so when we repeat back our statistics, we create a 0 to 100 scale. So if you answered very unhappy, you get 0, very happy, you get 100. Actually, I think a good score for a team is 70 to 80. I think it would be crazy if they were 100 all the time. Well, you know, because
it'd be a bit culty.
Yes, and also you think, you know, and if I do a reflective practice on my life, the sort of biggest problems I've got into in life is overriding negative signals with my positivity. I'm quite a positive guy. I sort of smile a lot. I have enthusiasm. I go forward, and actually I don't notice the signals and actually override them. And actually you need to be aware of those. So actually listening to when people have had a bad week is really vital, because that's how you'll learn, how things can go better, and so I think that it's a rare week that I would put very happy, because that has to be exceptional, and so there is an optimization level for certain.
So what's
but you don't want to be in the negative.
Yeah, what's interesting about Friday Pulse, and I'm not selling it on your behalf, Nick, so I'm making observation of something. So in the client where it's been deployed, so one of the narratives that could come around something like Friday Pulse is it's all about happiness at the exclusion of all else. Let's all be rah. But that's not actually what happens. So what's been really interesting is to see, on the one hand, this welling up an eruption of acknowledgements and thanks, lovely, because there needed to be some of that. But what's been really interesting is the issues that people, the few kind of problems that people have raised, and how that has been initially regarded. So the first response from my client was effectively they weren't going to publish them. And I said, why not? People have actually said, I've got questions or concerns about this. This is an opportunity for total transparency. There was nothing in it that was personal. It was all appropriate. And that's what I find is interesting, is that you're effectively offering your clients something which on the one hand says this is about creating cultures where people can be happy and fulfilled and productive, but you're not shying away from the shadow. You're actually giving people permission to go, I'm not happy about this. And then creating the challenge for an organisation, which is, what are you going to do about that?
Yeah.
And so where that gets me is what goes to is a question for you, which is, have you ever had a client really struggle with the messages that are coming from employees where they're saying, look, we're really not happy about this.
I would say that some clients want more of that. They actually feel a bit worried about the positive things in a sense, and they feel that there's an avoidance of some of the frustrations and difficulties. And there's always a demand from a client that we should have anonymous negative feedback possibilities. And actually, we want to mirror a culture where it's okay to say challenges. So we say, no, you have to name them. And part of the reason is that people start going, oh, I hate Steve or something if you make it anonymous. And if I said, Nick, oh, I really struggle with you, Steve, we could do something about it. But if I'm anonymous and I go, it doesn't help anything. You get into trolling. So we have a strong line on that we don't allow anonymous feedback. We say it to be named. And actually that makes some of our clients nervous that they don't get enough to some of the darker side, I would say. We do have some clients that, if they're going through a huge change, like, we've got a client at the moment that's being taken over, there's a lot of anxiety in it. And we just see response rates really drop. People aren't able to really share it because they don't feel, because they're out of control anyway. They know they're about to get fired or they're about to get merged into somebody. It's not surprising that they can't use it. So I think I'm saying I don't know, I think, in some ways, but I think that some people use it really, really well. And I know that if you pick up frustrations and deal with them, people will then start to answer more often and you get the tool working much better.
Which relates to what Emma's said in the question there, in her first question. What advice can you give to help colleagues understand and realise they're also able to contribute to their happiness, rather than being the organisation's responsibility? And there's something here about learned helplessness. That,
yes,
are you in your culture work as a leadership team deciding to do this in a top-down way? So my question, I guess, for Emma would be, what's the conversation that might need to be scaffolded to help understand why it is people are not speaking? So where I went to was, there's an organisation, and this is in the public domain, so you may be able to find it. It was Yorkshire Building Society. They won an award for this, I think. It must have been about 6-7 years ago. And they did some culture work there, which started with some social network analysis, and they found the 50 or 100 most connected employees, regardless of position, regardless of status. And they invited a load of them to a room, and they started the session by simply saying, so what do we all need to talk about then? That was the intervention. And Emma, so the question you posed there, that's why I get curious, is so what is the conversation that might be ripe or pregnant in that system that is waiting to come out, and what is it that's stopping people from actually being able to voice their needs? Which is, your second question there about introverted people, which is, it's a similar thing. I've worked with people who, in organisations, who are introverts, who've really struggled by a senior leadership driven culture and expectation that everybody is extroverted and very rah and very up. And one guy I remember saying to me, if I put a balloon on somebody's desk saying congratulations, everybody will think it's absurd because they will know that is not me. So there's something here about, I'm going back to inquiry and working through differences.
Absolutely. And the introvert extrovert one, I'm an extrovert. I think that's probably quite obvious. And I have to learn to shut up in team meetings, and I have to learn to listen. And the wonderful thing is, I think introverts often really hold the truth that extroverts can ride straight over and not notice. And so it became, part of my process of learning how to be a group facilitator on the Surrey course was learning to work with silence. It was learning to leave silence when you're working in a group, to not cover it up. I think this might be an anxiety thing for many people, is that we're anxious about silence. And actually, can we sit and hold a space? And I've been known to tease groups by saying, I'm not going to move on until I get a question, or I'm not going to, I'm quite happy to sit here, and then eventually someone starts to speak, particularly, when you're and then of course, if one person does, other people can do. But introverts often also, there's not only introverts, there's also pace of thinking, is that I'm a very quick thinker. I used to work in a team with a very brilliant psychologist, but you have to ask him the next day what he thought about yesterday's meeting, because it took him a while to form it in his brain, and then he'd come up with something brilliant the next day, whereas I would come up with 3 ideas straight away. They might not be good ones, but my brain works very quickly, and actually learning how people's differences, how they are, and if you want to get the best out of your team, responding to how those differences are. An anxious extrovert must be a right pain, actually, because they're going to fill spaces straight away. So I think it is about noticing, and of course those very differences, are very important in creating a functional team, because actually having differences makes for more creativity, more views on how we approach things. So it's very important.
We've got another question in there from Neve. Hello, Neve. Nice to see you. If it's the same Neve, I think it is. What do you perceive as the key facets in supporting managers to move out of command and control mindset? In a nutshell, reflective practice would be my response, which is, how do you create the conditions and the permission to allow managers to understand themselves and their teams better, so that they are not as inhibited and constrained by their own fears and anxieties, their own shame, and are able to open different kinds of conversations to the ones that they may do at the moment. I can tell you what it isn't. It's not coaching cultures. The typical response to things like this is, we need to help our managers to become better coaches. No. The manager line report relationship by definition means the manager cannot be a coach, in my view. The power differential means it's not, there's no equality. So for me, it requires a different understanding about the nature of learning and development in organisations to the dominant discourse, would be my thinking.
It's quite interesting. We're actually almost up at time, but okay, can you say if the manager isn't a coach? So I think of a coach as being facilitative rather than prescriptive.
Well, okay, there's a difference between a coaching style, right, and
Yes.
facilitative. I absolutely agree. Can a manager facilitate or help a team member do some inquiry? Absolutely. But there's a difference between that and the rhetoric of the whole coaching culture thing. Okay, so I'll give you one very simple example. A few years ago, it's a very large global financial organization that experimented with having team coaches alongside line managers. And what happened over time was the line managers ended up being responsible for all the hygiene stuff, salaries, annual reviews, holidays. And for problem solving or support and challenge, the team all went to the team coaches. Okay, so they're different types of conversation, and they require subtly different skills. And I don't think that all managers are either want to and can facilitate those sorts of conversations equally.
So in that example, did the coaches sort of sit across several teams and basically they supported the team coaches?
That I don't know. That I don't know. It was the size of the organisation. It's entirely possible they did. Yes.
Yes, that would seem. I mean, I don't know if you know about Bertshult. I think they had so Bertshult is a Dutch, Dutch health organisation, and they're basically very team orientated. If a local team gets more than 10 people, they have to split into two groups, and they're very self-autonomy. They basically have thousands and thousands of community health workers, but they have a central support function which is very small. And the central support function is about that admin side, but also available there is coaches to help any interpersonal issues in the groups as they are, to support them to what their goals are. And they see the organisation as upside down. They see that as lower function than this function across it. Anyway, it's an interesting model, and we're very nearly out of time here. So Emma, if you're still on there, I would really like it if we could quickly poll people about how they've experienced this webinar. So it's a very simple question, the Net Promoter Score one, which is very recommended. So if you could be honest in your answer, because we're looking for good feedback. If you could put in the chat something you liked about it or something you think that could have been better, that would be great too. Steve, while the poll's going on, do you want to just sum up what you feel you learnt or anything you want people to take home?
I think I'm left with more questions than answers.
That's not good, right?
I think there's a whole load of stuff lurking under this around how we define culture. We didn't even get onto the projections that clients have of you. That's one of our conversations. What do you expect as the projections of clients? And also, I'm left with questions around, which I regularly have, about our assumptions about the nature of organising, which are predicated on market managerialism as being the sole way we organise, pretty much. So, and how does that then?
Your sentences are so dense. There's so much in just that one sentence.
Yeah. So I'll leave it there because there's more, but
Yeah. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I said to people, actually, please ask questions, because I could just sit and talk to you for hours, I think. And I think there's more things for me to learn about how we approach that complexity. It's reminded me of an awful lot of things. And actually, one of the things I really try to do in Friday Pulse is create a simple methodology so that actually people can approach that complexity. I can see another question answer. I feel relaxed. It feels like an interactive. Can you do one each day, please?
We'll need some more shirts, though, Nick.
I've got a whole wardrobe up there of different coloured shirts. And in fact, they need some rotation because they seem to be going to fade at once. So you told me I should wear different shirts today, so I have them. Are there any more questions or comments, particularly in there, Emma or Megan, that we should be talking about?
No more questions or anything that I can see.
That's great. Well, Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you
for joining us today, or me joining you. I don't really know which way.
Joined each other.
Joined each other.
Yeah.
And thank you for all your questions and humouring two men to discuss these. I think they're very important topics, and I think I take away really actually a sort of affirmation that it's this reflective, deliberate practice which is really what is needed. And I think it, you know, that idea that what was it? It was you said pace and general laziness of people to avoid that. It's where, you know, it's where our learnings are. It's why I've liked the therapeutic practice. I've returned to it when I've had complex issues in my own life, you know, and I think that being a team leader, leading an organization is not easy. It's a complex thing.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it is the only solution, isn't it, really, Steve, is to reflect and learn and cyclically. I think it is. It's the only golden rules. I think so. You could measure happiness as well to go on to help you, but you know, actually the key thing about that is it kickstarts a deliberate practice, and actually that is the point of Friday Pulse, is to, you know, the numbers are the numbers, but the actual thing is the conversations. That's where things start to register and learn, and they are an invitation to do that. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time today and joining. Friday Pulse does regular webinars. Our next one will be Tuesday, the what of October? Sorry, Emma, Megan, I forgot my dates right now.
It's the 4th.
Tuesday, the 4th of October. We normally do 4 p.m. so that our American cousins and North American cousins can join us. And the next one is going to be on being positively productive. So actually, we talk a lot about how happiness leads to increased productivity, but why does it? Why does it? And actually complexity is part of it. It's actually how we deal with complexity, but I'll be presenting data and I'll be using more slides and actually data. I'm a statistician, I like data. So it will be a bit more statistical, but lots of questionnaires, answers. That's where the joy comes. So thank you very much, Steve, for today. And thank you, Megan, and Emma in the background as well. See you soon, Steve. Bye.